Hi guys, greetings to all. So passes one more week, and I hope in this past week that you've been able to find opportunities to connect with people. And as this week we've been leading up to the day of prayer, I hope that you've been able to connect with God through prayer. This week's Stay in Place champion is going to be Lazarus. And while it may seem like Lazarus's 4-day quarantine in a tomb wasn't quite voluntary, he did nevertheless stay in place until he got the all clear sign from Jesus to go ahead and come out. And I'm sure just like us, Lazarus would have preferred to come out a little bit earlier, but he is our Stay in Place champion for the week. And I do feel like this story is extremely relatable to those who are struggling to find God through this whole ordeal, and maybe even dealing with faith-shaking grief that may be coming through what we're all experiencing at this time. So let's dive in and see some of the parallels and maybe even find the encouragement that we can gain from the story of Lazarus. So this week, the story of Lazarus is found in John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44. I encourage you to read the whole story. I'm just going to go through different verses throughout today, but it's a great story of hope and of faith, right? So our story starts off with Jesus getting word that his good friend is sick, and probably by the time he's getting the word that he's sick, Lazarus may or may not already even be dead. But Jesus' reaction to this news is sort of off and odd in my perception. The first thing that Jesus says is, "This is for the glory of God," which is okay. And then the second thing he says is, "I'm glad I wasn't there." And so we're going to dive into these two concepts, and I can't help but relate some of this to our present situation, because I myself have been trying to encourage us to do the first part, right? Find God's glory in all of this. But also feeling a little lost as to why God isn't here making this better. Like, why isn't he just healing people? And this theme of why isn't God here kind of resonates throughout this story as well. It comes up quite a few times. So in the story, like Jesus next, after he hears this, he kind of hangs out for a few days, but the next part we want to focus on is going to be he arrives in Bethany, and Martha goes out to greet him, kind of like picking him up from the airport, I guess. She goes away from where they're staying, and she goes all the way out to the edge of town basically, and greets Jesus. And amazingly, in the wake of her deep sorrow, her disappointment, and just her grief of the loss of her brother, and without understanding of the current plan, Martha goes out there and has a conversation with Jesus, and her faith just shines through. She makes huge proclamation statements, such as in verse 22. She says, she starts off with that kind of theme. She says, "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would have not died," right? And that theme pops up again later. But then she says this huge statement. She says, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And she goes on to talking to Jesus, and he asks her if he believes something, and she says this, "Yes, Lord," she told him, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world." I mean, these are huge statements. God will give you whatever you ask, and you are the Messiah. She's struggling. She's struggling with huge grief, right? Her brother has died. And yet she still has this faith. And she has no idea about what Jesus is about to do, because even later in verse 39, she's concerned when Jesus is rolling away the stone that it's going to smell, because Lazarus has been dead for quite some time. And if she knew that Jesus was going to be raising Lazarus from the dead, then she wouldn't be concerned about rolling the stone, because what good is raising Lazarus from the dead if he's stuck behind the stone, right? So she has no idea about what Jesus is about to do. And yet she is able to make these huge statements. And so in the wake of her grief, in the wake of her disappointment, in the wake of being upset, she's still able to have really amazing faith. And And I want to let you know that Jesus doesn't raise Lazarus for Martha and her faith. She's already got a faith that transcends tragedy. And Martha is sort of a continuation of our people in the Bible that can continue to see the big picture, that they don't get caught up on the small things, or they don't get caught up on the present situation. They know this first part, right? All for the glory of God, right? So she's got that part taken care of, and hopefully we can find encouragement in there. But what about this second part that Jesus says? He says, I'm glad I wasn't there. That's a really hard one to swallow, right? Like, what the heck, Jesus, right? Like, you're glad you weren't there? Doesn't he care about Mary and Martha? Like that's the first inclination I think you can get. Like, don't you care about these people? And on the contrary, though, right? Really, Jesus deeply, deeply cares, and we can see that here in verses 33. And when Jesus saw her, Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Continues on in verse 35, Jesus wept. And then again in 38, Jesus once more deeply moved came to the tomb. These verses, they show us that just because something is a part of God's plan, it doesn't mean that he isn't heartbroken for our grief and our sorrow. And these verses show us that God and Jesus, they mourn with us as we mourn the loss of family, as we mourn the loss of friends, as we mourn the loss of time, of jobs, of graduation, of other plans that we may have had, of our hopes and dreams and our ideas of what the month of March and the longest month of ever of April, and this lost month again of May. Like, we're losing that time per se, and our normal, and God is mourning this with us. I just want to let you guys know that Jesus here shows us that he mourns with us as we mourn. And it's okay to mourn these things. Even though we can convince ourselves, and we can have the faith of Martha, and we can see big picture, it's still okay to mourn. Jesus doesn't tell Martha, stop crying, right? He doesn't tell her, stop being upset. I'm about to do something amazing, right? Jesus already knew back in verse 11. He says this, way back. He says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to wake him up. This is before he goes to Bethany. He already knows that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But he still chooses to mourn with them, to have compassion, to be deeply moved, to weep with them, and to have empathy for those that are hurting. Jesus isn't, okay, stop, guys, I'm here, I'm going to make it all better. He mourns with them. He takes the time to embrace them. He takes the time to connect with them. So he wasn't glad he wasn't there because he didn't care. So then why was he glad? And so we're going to see that in verse 4. When Jesus first finds out about Lazarus, he says this sickness, literally talking about Lazarus' sickness, will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. He continues this thought all the way into verse 40 when he's standing across from the tomb, and he's talking to Martha, and he says, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And then he ultimately says in verse 42, he says, I knew that you, God, always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And then I'm going to jump all the way back to verse 15, because I think this is going to sum it up for us, right? His disciples didn't understand what it meant when he said that Lazarus is sleeping. And he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, the disciples, the people that are around Jesus at this time, I am glad I was not there, so that you, again, the disciples, may believe. But let us go to him. Jesus is glad that he wasn't there because this is giving him an opportunity to bring these people, so his disciples, Mary and Martha, and all the Jews that is talking about weeping, and all the people who are present, it gives them an opportunity to bring more people to faith and to strengthen the faith of those people that are around him that already have faith. He's creating a narrative that doesn't simply end with Lazarus waking up. He's giving a sneak peek into what's going to happen to him even further ahead in time. He's preparing them a way to maybe possibly understand what's about to happen to him in the future. And he's doing this all the while, and so that way in chapter 16, later in John chapter 16, he can say these things to them, right? Chapter 16, verses 22 and 24. He's telling the disciples, he's telling them about, basically he's going to die, right? And that this is going to be a tough time. So with you, now is your time of grief. But I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day, you will no longer ask me anything. I tell you the truth. My Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now, you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask, and you will receive, and your joy will be complete. Now is your time of grief. Now is our time of grief. This is a time of grieving, not just of lost life, but of lost time, of lost connection, of a lot of different losses that we've experienced. So now is our time of grief. But Jesus says, but I will see you again, and I will see you guys again, right? Face to face. And we'll see each other again, and we will rejoice, and no one will be able to take away that joy. So now is a time of grief. And let's encourage each other through mourning together this grief, our losses, our tough days here. But also know that God, our God, loves a great resurrection story. He loves it. He raising Lazarus from the dead, raising his own son from the dead. God loves a great comeback story. And this time right now that we're experiencing here is going to have great comeback stories, right? And I just want to let you know that together, as soon as this is all over, we're going to go back to the story of Lazarus in verse 44. And it's going to be like this. The dead man came out. Or in our case, the quarantine people will come out. Our hands and our feet will be wrapped with strips of linen and cloth all around our face. And Jesus will say to us, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Let us go. Right? We will rise from this. We will come back from this. We will get to come out of quarantine someday. It's not today. It may not be tomorrow. It may not be soon. I don't know. We don't know. But know that not only is God mourning with you, but we can celebrate and we can mourn together while knowing all these things are for the glory of God. And that he hasn't left us. He's there right beside us. And we're going to get through this together. We really are. This week's songs of encouragement is going to be Hold You Up by Shane Harper and Thy Word by Hillary Scott and the Scott family. These are both great songs of finding hope in the face of struggle. And so I look forward to coming with you again next week. I hope you guys all have a great weekend and see you next time. God bless.